Hi, whether you're coming here via the Genesis series in Radical Bible or the 2 Samuel series, welcome either way, because it shows the intersection of the two as they come to an end. And so as you can see on the total screen here, I have no Bible up today because we're just going to look at these themes. We see on the left side the parallels and the closing transition of Genesis to Exodus and in 2 Samuel 21 and 1 Kings 2. And on the right side, the core issues. So we're going to look at the parallels first, and then we'll see how they respond to the core issues. And this is a unique pattern in the Bible. There's no other places that I'm aware of, or that scholars that I'm aware of know of, where a major book ends with a similar pattern. And so we can see the pattern right here, theme by theme. So first of all, famine. So there's the famine in Genesis 47 that Joseph deals with by selling grain and enslaving the Egyptians. Whereas in 2 Samuel, there's a famine, and David understands it's because he did something wrong, and he allows for the blood guilt that belonged to the people of Saul, on him because of the people of Saul, to be dealt with via violence. But that's not what the issue becomes resolved by. It becomes resolved by the nonviolent witness of Rizpah sitting by the bodies of her dead family members for an entire season or more. And so we'll see how those contrast. But the famine near the end and a king or royal representative is the key thing. Then there's in both of them a list of names of important people with evaluative comments. In Genesis, we see in Genesis 49, Israel united as one family. And I want to note, if we consider that to be a standard element, that the sons of Israel are the Israelites and those are all the sons of Jacob, it's Genesis that invents that notion. We don't see that in Exodus. We don't see that in Deuteronomy. We don't see that in the monarchy story. We know about tribes, but we don't know anything about them being all children of one person, Jacob. So the idea of the nation is gathered as one family. The people who make you who you are your siblings is unique there to Genesis, at least the starting point. We find it in other texts, but Genesis is the invention of that. In 2 Samuel, in 2 Samuel 23, we see the nation is secured by a list of foreign warriors. And the text doesn't comment at all on the foreign nature of it, something that the Ezra and Nehemiah people after exile would be horrified by. And they're not family members, and they're not even an army. They're simply mercenaries that are the list of David's valuable warriors. So we'll look at the comparison there. Then curiously also, and this is such an unlikely sequence, a famine, a list of names of important people, and then a threshing floor. And as my note below has at the end of this here, no famines in the Torah outside Genesis, and no famines in 1 and 2 Samuel outside this one. There's only the threshing floor of Nacon elsewhere in the entire Bible in terms of threshing floors. So these are the two of the three threshing floors. And a threshing floor is, of course, a place in which grain is separated, but it also is a place of many kinds of symbolic actions that are looked at in both in 2 Samuel 24 and in the Genesis 50 context. But here, the point is that it's a threshing floor of a named foreigner in a moment associated with death. So in Genesis, the Egyptians mourn Jacob at the threshing floor of Atad, which is in the land of Canaan. And in 2 Samuel, David purchases the threshing floor of Araunah, which becomes the site of the Jerusalem temple. So there we see a Jebusite in the land that was traditionally Jebusite, but now occupied by the Judahites around David. And here we see in Canaan, of all the different peoples in Canaan, the threshing floor of Atad. And as I was noting there in the Genesis 50 videos, we don't know if Atad is a name or simply a description. So we don't know much about that there, but the two threshing floors. Then, as the transition goes toward 1 Kings in the case of 2 Samuel and toward Exodus and the end of Genesis, although we're not quite in Exodus yet in this question, there's a dispute among the king's or royal officials' sons and brothers over the powerful brother's potential violence. So in Genesis, we see at the very end, after everything seemed fine, that Joseph's brothers fear that he still bears a grudge against them, but he offers them comfort that God is with them in that. And we as careful readers have to wonder if that's true or not, but we don't hear anything about their relationship other than that there seems to be a half century in which they live together in Egypt where nothing important enough happens that the narrator has to tell us about it. And then in 1 Kings, Solomon's brother Adonijah fears his brother, and Solomon has him murdered. So the exact opposite consequence there. Then there's the death of the king, the royal official. In Genesis, Joseph dies in Egypt, but his bones will later be carried back. But that comes in different texts. That comes in later in Exodus and then in the book of Joshua, where we see that story played out. Certainly inserted later by whoever wrote Genesis 50 to make that all fit together. And then in 2 Samuel, David dies and Solomon rules with a marriage alliance from Pharaoh, which makes a nice connection there, not only between Genesis and 2 Samuel, but between Pharaoh and Solomon and Joseph and Pharaoh as well. And I look at that in my book, Come Out My People, and we'll look at that more when we look at the First Kings series that I'll be beginning momentarily here after that I finish 2 Samuel, and we'll see the complexity of the relationship between Egypt and Judah at the time of Solomon and after that. And then finally, the subsequent enslavement. In 1 Kings 4, Solomon enslaves his own people, the Israelites, setting slave masters over the districts in which they're in, along with tribute carriers. And then in Exodus 1, Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites. And again, as I'll point out in From Come Out My People, the Exodus story is really an allegory of the David, Solomon, Rehoboam sequence. And so in that sense, Solomon and the second Pharaoh, the one who doesn't know Joseph, are the same person. When that Pharaoh dies and Moses goes back and calls for the liberation and the parting of the Reed Sea and all that business, that's Rehoboam, the one from whom Jeroboam rebels. And again, we'll look at that as we get through 1 Kings. And so the consequence here is that in Genesis Exodus, a new Pharaoh is installed and enslaves Egypt, and in 1 Kings, Solomon appoints Adoniram over the forced labor of Israel. So let's look just for a minute here at how that plays out on these core issues and why the authors might have put those things there. One thing we can't say is which came first. As I've been noting, the Joseph story is late if the main story of Genesis is from the time of exile, and the Joseph story is sometime after that, either from the time of exile, as some scholars think, or the time of the Persians' occupation after exile, as scholars like Brett thinks, or perhaps even a couple centuries later under the Ptolemaic Egyptian control of the region of Israel and Judah, after the time of Alexander the Great. In any of those situations, these issues would still be key issues, and they're key issues at any time. So we don't know exactly which was composed first. Certainly 2 Samuel and 1 Kings are part of the larger composition of the Deuteronomic history that certainly couldn't have been composed till the last part of it's narrated, till the time of exile. But as I've been arguing, and a number of other scholars argue, the succession narrative that we've been looking at through the reign of David and the succession in Solomon, which is exactly the transition here, seems more likely to be roughly contemporaneous with the actual succession to justify to the audience why Solomon should succeed rather than Adonijah or somebody else. So if that's the case, then the Genesis-Exodus transition is modeling itself after the 2 Samuel, 1 Kings transition. But we can't know that for sure. It certainly seems likely from my perspective, though. So we see what the questions raise. The famine raises the question of where do we turn for food? In the Genesis story, with great irony, it's Joseph who provides food for a prophet, not turning to God for food at all. In the Exodus story, of course, later, the question is the manna, and it's turning to God, the Creator, for food, and the people want to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt. That's not a famine story, but it certainly is an absence of food story, and the word famine from the Hebrew simply means a hunger. So whether there's a famine or just simply a desert where there's no food, when they experience hunger, Exodus calls them to turn to the Creator for food, whereas in Genesis, a story all about the Creator, the Egyptians turned to Joseph for food, as well as Jacob and his family. We never heard of Jacob praying to Yahweh or seeking Yahweh's guidance. He just simply sends his sons to Egypt for food. And so that's one of the questions is, do you rely on empire for food, or do you rely on the creator God for food? And the list is very interesting because in the 2 Samuel story, in those last chapters, there are hints, as one was about the famine in Rizpah, and the other's about the threshing floor, as we'll look at in a second, that is trying to undermine the otherwise clear message that monarchy is what saves them from the Philistines and that David is a key leader. But when we see the list of his 30, the people who are celebrated, it's all about killing. They're all described simply as killing machines of how many people they killed, and I won't show the chart here. You can see it from my videos on 2 Samuel 23, but it's all about celebrating killing. And the fact that they're foreign is all listed. So there's no sense of ethnic identity. There's simply a sense of a king who hires powerful warriors and holds people together. Is David interested in his ethnicity? We never see anything about it. He's reigning from Jerusalem over a territory called Judah, but does he see himself as a Judahite? It's never named that way. So in that sense, the monarchical king is beyond ethnicity and is simply binding together by force. Whereas in Genesis, what we see, as I was noting, is family. bound together as family. And we see how many times that will play out also in the New Testament, seeing the people of God as bound as siblings, as brothers and sisters and parents and children. And that comes ironically, of course, in the end of Genesis, when the issue was, are they bound by fealty to Joseph, who's got his power from Pharaoh? And so what's presented as what we see in the books of Samuel, the reign of a king who provides through the military or through his power, is undermined by the calling upon them to be bound by family. Then with the threshing floor, which represents in one way or another worship. As I was just noting, the Egyptians mourn for the dead Jacob at the site of the threshing floor. And as we see in 2 Samuel, there's mourning there at the threshing floor as well. I'm sorry, there's worship there, anticipating, not mourning, but worship, anticipating what we see in the books of Chronicles, and which is understood by the general Jewish sense later, is that the threshing floor is the place from which the temple was built. Although the books of Samuel and 1 Kings don't say that directly. But what it does say directly is it was purchased from a quote-unquote foreigner, a foreigner to David, but actually an indigenous person who's not a foreigner, a Jebusite, the very people who were in the land before David took it. And yet there seems to be no problem. And notice what it's saying powerfully. The temple is built on the land that belonged to a foreigner. And the foreigner is not killed or even displaced. The threshing floor is purchased, but nothing is said about Araunah having to leave, or his family, or any other Jebusites who were there. And so the temple is established on something that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah would be horrified by, the idea that foreigners are involved directly in that. And note that both Genesis and Exodus and 2 Samuel and Kings establish that sense of intercultural relationship. Joseph with his two foreign-born Egyptian sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, that we heard Jacob says they are mine, so they become Israelites. And then, as I was noting, David not only taking the threshing floor the temple built on, but of course he has wives who are not Judahites either, of various ethnicities, and his children, who are supposed to be the kings forever on the throne, according to 2 Samuel 7, are partially foreigners, as David is, having Moabite lineage, as we see in the book of Ruth. So on both end of Genesis transition to Exodus and the 2 Samuel, the transition to 1 Kings, allows for intercultural relationships right in the middle of Jerusalem, contrary to Deuteronomy and contrary to Ezra and Nehemiah. Then what about the disputes among the brothers over power? And it raises the general question of what authority does God allow us to have over each other, and how are disputes to be resolved? According to Genesis, the answer is none. That only God rules, and that people are all equal. So Genesis is anarchic in the most literal sense, that humans are to have no rulers over each other. And that really makes the Joseph story stand out for that. And that's one reason why in my interpretation of the Joseph story, I challenge the various interpretations that believe Joseph's claim that God gave him the wisdom and power and led him into this, because it runs contrary to everything else we've seen in Genesis. Invites us to recognize what happens in an imperial narrative is played out over a creation narrative. Does the imperative narrative just take us over and allow us to forget the creation narrative that was more basic? And that, at least in the ground of authority here. How are disputes to be resolved? Well, Abraham resolves one dispute with violence when Lot is taken captive in the midst of a war, but otherwise it's done non-violently. He engages with foreigners, both his ancestors on his wife's side, Laban's family, but also the Hittites by purchase or by offering of material exchange. So by non-violent exchange. Of course, in the books of Samuel and the monarchy, the disputes are resolved simply through violence. Among brothers, both the sons of Zeruiah and the Joab family or their brothers are violent amongst themselves, as well as with David's sons that we see here, as well as we already saw with Amnon and Absalom over the rape of Absalom's sister Tamar. So violence reigned there, contrary to what we see in Genesis, and contrary to what is suggested by the very end of 2 Samuel, with the nonviolent action of Rizpah that assuages Yahweh more than the violence of getting rid of the blood guilt. And then the death of a king, or the death of a high king representative, as in the case of Joseph. How does authority pass across generations? Is it, as it seemed to suggest in 2 Samuel 7, or as it says in 2 Samuel 7, that Yahweh insists that there'll be one like from David's loins on the throne forever? So it's just by divine fiat, which in fact doesn't actually happen over the long haul. So one has to wonder about that. Or does it pass? Is there authority across generations, or does authority just arise as each person gets older and has authority through their experience with younger people? Genesis doesn't really talk that much about the question of authority. Certainly parents have authority over children, but that's about all there is. How do divine and human authority intersect? Well, Genesis is absolutely clear that when human beings act without listening to God, starting in the garden, things go wrong. So the answer is that God has the authority, and humans' call is to listen to it to get everything we need in terms of clarity of responding to all these questions. In 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, of course, they claim divine authority for a king, and Joseph claims divine authority for everything he's done that's brought his family away from the promise and into the land of Egypt. They'll be slaves. So careful readers ought to wonder about the intersection of divine and human authority when it's in the form of kings claiming authority to dominate. And then enslavement. In both situations, there's enslavement of the Israelites, in the first case of the Egyptians in Genesis 47, but of course of the Israelites, as the book of Exodus finds that they've multiplied, and the second Pharaoh is terrified of them, that they will side with their Egypt's enemies in the case of war. So what do they do in face of oppression and injustice? Of course, we know in Exodus, Moses is called upon from the burning bush to exercise the power of Yahweh's persuasion to get people to leave and trust in Yahweh, which is quite a battle. If you know the book of Exodus, they're very hesitant to trust in Moses, or even to trust in Yahweh for that matter. In the stories of the monarchy, the answer is war. If the Philistines are hard on them, then you attack them. And even in the situation, as we'll see eventually with Jeroboam's rebellion, they don't engage in war against Solomon, but they run away. So that's following the Exodus pattern, and that's one reason why I was suggesting the Exodus story is really there to justify Jeroboam. But that's a little different than what we saw in Genesis. And then this is just a little summary, as I've been noting, how these transitional chapters challenge the theology of the larger book. So Genesis, I've been noting in this video and beyond, is nonviolent anti-city throughout, calling for complete dependence on the Creator for provision. It's also focused on the land of Canaan as the place of Yahweh's promise. In the end, it raises the challenge of Joseph as provider, which he names specifically, I will provide for you, claiming divine authority for dominating authority, and the question of the land as Canaan or Egypt. So it really raises questions that run contrary to everything else we saw. 2 Samuel is the opposite. It starts off and is violent and nationalistic throughout most of the text. It presents the, quote, house of David as the eternal holder of the office of king in Jerusalem. In the end, though, it raises the challenge of whether David's quote-unquote sin that we hear in 2 Samuel 21 is being too violent, and whether worship can be established on the land of a foreigner. In doing so, it reminds readers of 1 Samuel 8, the cost of having a king, which is they take. So what we see when we look at the comparison of these two stories side by side here is that the authors recognize that what I call the religion of empire and the religion of creation are always in tension. They, of course, don't have those labels, but they certainly knew the poles of the spectrum I've been talking about, with the violent king and domination on the one hand and living on the earth, trusting the Creator on the other. And they end their stories with interweaving that suggests that it's never going to end with just they lived happily ever after, but with the reality that our biblical ancestors like us today must continue to discern God's call in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. So that's the connection between those two books. I hope that's helpful. See you next time, either for the books of Kings or something else you may find here helpful in Radical Bible. See you then. Bye-bye.